The fluorescent lights of the office building cast harsh shadows across the marble lobby as Mark Townsend pushed through the revolving doors, his worn leather briefcase clutched tightly in his calloused hand. The annual company gala had ended hours ago, but the echoes of forced laughter and clinking champagne glasses still rang in his ears. He had stayed only as long as protocol demanded, his mind constantly drifting to the small apartment across town, where his 8-year-old daughter Sophie was probably fast asleep, her stuffed elephant tucked under her chin. The babysitter would be wondering when he'd return, just as Mark was wondering why he'd bothered attending at all. Corporate events were a necessary evil in his world, obligations that came with the territory of being a mid-level project manager at Sterling Dynamics. As he waited for the elevator, the sound of heels clicking against marble drew his attention. The rhythm was uneven, stumbling, nothing like the confident staccato that usually announced the arrival of Catherine Sterling, the company's formidable CEO. But there she was, emerging from the executive elevator with her usually perfect composure completely shattered. Her designer gown, which had commanded every room she'd entered just hours before, now hung askew on her frame. Her meticulously styled hair had escaped its elegant updo, and her makeup was smeared across her cheeks like watercolors in the rain. Mark had seen Catherine Sterling intimidate board members with a single glance, reduce grown men to stammering apologies with the arch of an eyebrow. But the woman swaying before him bore no resemblance to that corporate titan. Catherine's eyes, usually sharp as laser-cut diamonds, were glassy and unfocused as they found his face. For a moment, she seemed not to recognize him, squinting as if trying to bring his features into clarity. Then something clicked, and her expression shifted to one of profound confusion mixed with what might have been relief. "Mark," she said, his name slurring slightly on her tongue. "Mark Townsend. Project manager, 3rd floor, Sophie's father." The fact that she remembered his daughter's name, something he'd mentioned only once during a brief elevator conversation months ago, caught him completely off guard. In all his years at Sterling Dynamics, Catherine had never acknowledged his personal life, never shown any interest in the struggles of balancing single parenthood with corporate demands. "Mrs. Sterling," Mark said carefully, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you all right? Do you need me to call someone for you?" The question seemed to amuse her in a bitter way, and she let out a laugh that was more sob than sound. "Call someone?" she repeated, leaning against the marble wall for support. "Who exactly would I call, Mark? My assistant went home hours ago. My driver quit last week after I screamed at him for being 2 minutes late. My board of directors would love nothing more than to see me stumble, literally and figuratively." She gestured vaguely toward the empty lobby. "I have built an empire, Mark. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I have power that makes senators return my calls. And yet, at this moment, you are literally the only person in this entire city who might give a damn whether I make it home safely tonight." The raw honesty in her voice hit Mark like a physical blow. He had always assumed that people like Catherine Sterling lived in a different universe, surrounded by luxury and adoration, insulated from the kind of loneliness that kept him awake some nights after Sophie went to bed. But looking at her now, seeing the way her shoulders shook with barely contained emotion, he realized that power and money were just different kinds of prisons. "Let me drive you home," Mark said quietly, the decision forming before he'd fully thought it through. "You can't drive in this condition, and you're right about not having anyone to call. But that doesn't mean you have to figure this out alone." Catherine studied his face for a long moment, searching for some hidden agenda, some angle he might be playing. Mark understood her suspicion. In her world, kindness always came with a price tag. Generosity was just another form of manipulation. But as the seconds stretched between them, something in his steady gaze seemed to convince her that his offer was genuine. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying the weight of years of disappointment. "Why would you help me? I've never been particularly kind to you. I've denied your requests for flexible hours, passed you over for promotions, treated you like furniture in meetings. Why would you risk your job, your reputation, to help someone who has shown you nothing but indifference?" Mark considered the question seriously, thinking about Sophie's bedtime stories, about the values he tried to instill in her every day, about how his own mother had raised him to see people as human beings first, titles and positions second. "Because that's what decent people do," he said simply. "They help when someone needs help, regardless of the circumstances. And because I think maybe you're not as indifferent as you pretend to be. You remembered my daughter's name, Mrs. Sterling. That tells me there's more going on beneath the surface than you let anyone see." The truth of his words seemed to crack something open inside Catherine, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She nodded wordlessly, allowing him to guide her toward the parking garage. The drive to Catherine's penthouse was mostly silent, broken only by the soft hum of the radio and occasional directions murmured from the passenger seat. Mark found himself stealing glances at his boss, noting how different she looked without the armor of authority wrapped around her. Her face, relaxed by alcohol and exhaustion, revealed lines of stress he'd never noticed before, a fragility that her usual composure kept carefully hidden. Catherine's penthouse was everything Mark had expected, and nothing like what he'd imagined. The space was magnificent, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city lights below, furniture that probably cost more than his annual salary arranged with museum-like precision. But it felt cold, sterile, more like a display than a home. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, no signs that anyone actually lived here. "Can I get you some water?" Mark asked, already moving toward the kitchen before she could answer. The refrigerator was nearly empty, containing only expensive champagne and takeout containers from restaurants he'd never be able to afford. He found a bottle of water and returned to find Catherine staring out at the city below, her expression unreadable. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said without looking at him. "I built all of this to prove that I could. Every deal, every acquisition, every ruthless decision was designed to show the world that Catherine Sterling was a force to be reckoned with. I wanted respect, Mark. I wanted people to see me as someone who mattered, someone who couldn't be ignored or dismissed. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a reputation instead. I wake up every morning in this beautiful prison, and I put on my armor, and I go to war with the world. And every night, I come back here to count my victories in an empty room." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and Mark felt his heart clench with unexpected sympathy. He thought about his own small apartment, cluttered with Sophie's artwork and school projects, filled with the comfortable chaos of real life. It might not have granite countertops or imported marble floors, but it was warm, lived in, loved. "Mrs. Sterling," he said gently, sitting on the edge of the coffee table so he could face her directly, "when was the last time you did something just because it made you happy? Not because it was strategic or profitable or good for the company, but just because it brought you joy." The question seemed to genuinely puzzle her, and she was quiet for a long time before answering. "I honestly can't remember," she admitted. "Everything in my life serves a purpose, Mark. Every relationship is transactional. Every decision is calculated. I've forgotten how to do things simply because they feel good." "It doesn't have to stay that way," he said quietly. "You have more power than almost anyone on the planet to change your life, to choose happiness over success for once. The question is whether you think you deserve that happiness." Catherine's eyes snapped to his face, sharp and searching, despite the alcohol in her system. "Do you think I deserve it?" she asked, and Mark could hear the genuine uncertainty in her voice. Mark studied her face, seeing past the reputation and the power to the woman underneath. "I think everyone deserves a chance at happiness," he said finally. "But I also think you're going to have to decide whether you want it badly enough to tear down some of those walls you've built around yourself." They sat in silence for a while, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. "I should go," Mark said finally, standing and straightening his jacket. "Sophie will be wondering where I am. And the babysitter has school tomorrow." Catherine nodded, not looking at him, her gaze still fixed on the glittering panorama beyond the windows. But as he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "Mark," she said, her tone softer than he'd ever heard it. "Thank you. For tonight, for not leaving me to figure this out alone. I know it wasn't your responsibility, and I know I haven't earned your kindness. But thank you." Mark paused with his hand on the door handle, considering his words carefully. "Mrs. Sterling," he said without turning around, "everyone deserves to have someone who cares whether they make it home safely. Everyone deserves that basic human dignity, regardless of what they've done or how they've lived. I hope you remember that tomorrow." The elevator ride down felt endless, each floor marking the distance between Catherine's isolated luxury and the real world waiting below. Mark thought about the broken woman he'd left upstairs, wondering if she would remember any of their conversation in the morning, or if the alcohol would wash away this moment of vulnerability like so many others. The morning after arrived with the persistent buzz of Mark's alarm clock, cutting through dreams of marble lobbies and tear-streaked faces. Sophie bounded into his room as she did every weekday, her dark curls a chaotic halo around her face, chattering about the spelling test she was confident she'd ace and the art project that was due next Friday. Mark smiled and pulled her into a quick hug, breathing in the simple sweetness of childhood that centered him like nothing else could. As he made breakfast and packed her lunch, the events of the previous night felt almost surreal, like fragments of a movie he'd watched rather than lived through. At Sterling Dynamics, the atmosphere was charged with the particular tension that always followed company events. Colleagues huddled in small groups, dissecting who had said what to whom, analyzing every interaction for signs of favor or disapproval from the upper echelons. Mark moved through the hallways with his usual quiet efficiency, nodding politely to coworkers while avoiding the gossip circles that seemed to form spontaneously around coffee machines and copy centers. The call came at 10:30 sharp, delivered by Catherine's assistant with the kind of crisp professionalism that made even routine requests sound urgent. "Mrs. Sterling would like to see you in her office at your earliest convenience, Mr. Townsend." Catherine's office was a testament to power and control, all clean lines and strategic positioning designed to intimidate and impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city below, while her massive desk served as both workspace and barrier between her and the rest of the world. But the woman behind that desk looked different from the broken figure Mark had helped the night before. She wore her usual impeccable suit, her hair restored to its perfect style, her makeup flawlessly applied. Yet something in her eyes had changed, a softness that hadn't been there before. "Please, sit down," Catherine said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned across from her desk. Her voice carried its familiar authority, but the edge was softer somehow, less razor-sharp than usual. Mark settled into the chair, noting how the morning light caught the subtle signs of fatigue around her eyes, evidence that she hadn't slept much better than he had. "I want to thank you for last night," she said, her words carefully measured. "Your discretion and kindness meant more than you probably realize. I also want you to know that nothing about last night will affect your position here at Sterling Dynamics. Your job is secure, regardless of what you may have seen or heard." The formal tone was so at odds with the vulnerable woman from the night before that Mark felt a flash of disappointment. Had she really retreated so completely behind her professional facade? But as he looked more closely, Mark noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she straightened papers that were already perfectly aligned, the way her eyes didn't quite meet his directly. She wasn't dismissing what had happened, he realized. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how. "Mrs. Sterling," Mark said quietly, "you don't need to thank me. I did what anyone should do in that situation. And I want you to know that I would never use what happened last night against you or discuss it with anyone else. That's not who I am." "I've been thinking about what you said," Catherine continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "about tearing down walls and choosing happiness over success. It's not as simple as you make it sound, Mark. These walls aren't just barriers. They're the foundation everything else is built on. My reputation, my company, my entire identity is constructed around being untouchable, unreachable. I'm not sure there's anything left underneath anymore." The admission was so honest, so unguarded, that Mark felt his chest tighten with empathy. "I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for," Mark said gently. "It takes real courage to let someone see you vulnerable, to admit that you're hurting. The Catherine Sterling I helped last night wasn't weak. She was human. And that's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to build on." His words seemed to hit their mark, and Mark watched as something shifted in her expression, a flicker of hope breaking through the careful composure. The conversation was interrupted by the soft chime of Catherine's intercom, her assistant's voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mrs. Sterling, your 10:45 is here. Mark, would you be interested in having coffee sometime? Outside of the office, I mean. I find myself curious about your perspective on things, and I think I could use a friend who isn't afraid to tell me the truth." The request was so unexpected that Mark felt momentarily speechless. But looking at her now, seeing the careful hope in her eyes, he realized that this was her way of reaching across the chasm that separated their worlds. "I'd like that," Mark said simply. "But I should warn you, my schedule revolves around an 8-year-old's needs, so coffee might have to be somewhere that serves chocolate milk and doesn't mind the occasional temper tantrum." For the first time since he'd known her, Catherine Sterling laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed her entire face. The weeks that followed brought a series of small changes that rippled through Mark's carefully ordered life like stones thrown into still water. The coffee meetings with Catherine became a regular occurrence. Strange little interludes where the most powerful woman in the city sat across from him in family-friendly cafes, asking questions about single parenthood, and listening with surprising intensity to his stories about Sophie's school projects and playground dramas. At first, their conversations were stilted, formal, as if they were both speaking a language they hadn't quite mastered yet. But gradually, the walls between them began to lower, replaced by something that resembled genuine friendship. Catherine proved to be an unexpectedly good listener, her sharp intelligence turning toward the complexities of ordinary life with the same focus she brought to corporate strategy. She asked thoughtful questions about Sophie's education, about Mark's struggles to balance work and parenting, about the small joys and daily challenges that made up their world. In return, she began to share glimpses of her own life, stories about growing up as the only child of workaholic parents, about the loneliness of always being the smartest person in the room, about the weight of carrying other people's livelihoods on her shoulders. Sophie, with the adaptability of children, accepted Catherine's presence in their lives with curious enthusiasm. When Mark explained that his boss had become a friend and might occasionally join them for dinner or weekend outings, Sophie peppered him with questions about what bosses ate and whether they knew how to play board games. The first time Catherine joined them for pizza and a movie, Sophie spent the entire evening studying her with frank fascination, finally announcing that she seemed pretty normal for someone who gets to tell grown-ups what to do all day. Catherine's delighted laughter at this assessment convinced Mark that his daughter had unknowingly become his most valuable ally. The real test came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, when Mark's usual babysitter called in sick just as he was preparing to leave for an important client presentation. Sophie was running a low fever, nothing serious but enough to keep her home from school, and Mark found himself trapped between his responsibilities as a father and his obligations to his job. He was reaching for his phone to call Catherine's assistant and explain why he couldn't make the meeting when there was a knock at his apartment door. Catherine stood in the hallway, her designer coat dampened by rain, holding a bag from the pharmacy and wearing an expression of determined concern. "I heard through the office grapevine that Sophie was sick and your babysitter canceled," she said without preamble. "I thought you might need backup." The gesture was so unexpected, so fundamentally kind, that Mark felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was a woman who controlled millions of dollars in assets, who had entire departments at her beck and call, offering to babysit his daughter so he could attend a work meeting. Sophie, wrapped in blankets on the couch and slightly feverish, but alert, regarded Catherine with interest rather than shyness. "Are you really going to take care of me?" she asked, as if the concept required careful consideration. Catherine sat down beside her, her usual corporate demeanor softening into something gentler and more nurturing. "I'm going to try my best," she said seriously. "I've never taken care of a sick little girl before, so you might have to teach me. But I brought soup and juice and some books, and I promise to call your dad if you need anything at all." Sophie nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with these qualifications, and settled back against the cushions with the kind of trust that only children possess. When Mark returned home, he found Catherine and Sophie curled up together on the sofa, both of them fast asleep. Sophie's fever had broken, and she was breathing easily, her small hand resting trustingly on Catherine's arm. The sight hit Mark like a physical blow, not because it was shocking, but because it felt so fundamentally right. Catherine looked younger in sleep, her features relaxed and peaceful in a way he had never seen before. For just a moment, watching them together in the soft lamplight, Mark allowed himself to imagine what it might be like if this scene were permanent. Catherine stirred as he entered, blinking awake with the careful alertness of someone accustomed to being always on guard. But when she saw Mark's face, her expression softened into something that looked almost like contentment. "How did it go?" she whispered, careful not to wake Sophie. "Better than expected," Mark replied quietly, settling into the chair across from them. "How was she?" Catherine's smile was gentle and genuine, free of the calculated charm she wore in boardrooms. "Perfect," she said simply. "She taught me how to make blanket forts and explained the entire plot of her favorite movie. I think I'm beginning to understand why you never seem quite as impressed by corporate achievements as everyone else. This is what really matters, isn't it? These quiet moments, these simple connections. Everything else is just noise." The observation was so perceptive, so honest, that Mark felt something shift permanently in his understanding of Catherine Sterling. She wasn't just learning to be human again. She was discovering what she had missed by hiding behind her walls for so long. And in that discovery, Mark recognized the beginning of something that went beyond friendship, something that neither of them was quite ready to name, but both of them could feel growing in the space between them like a seed taking root in unexpected soil. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was undeniable. Over the following months, Catherine became a regular fixture in Mark and Sophie's life, joining them for weekend trips to museums and parks, helping with homework assignments that challenged even her formidable intellect, and gradually learning the rhythms of a life built around love rather than ambition. She still ran Sterling Dynamics with the same sharp efficiency that had made her legendary in business circles, but her leadership style had evolved into something more collaborative, more humane. Employees began to speak of her with respect rather than fear, and the company's culture shifted towards something that felt more like a community than a corporate machine. For Mark, watching Catherine discover the joys of ordinary life was like witnessing a master artist learn to paint with entirely new colors. She approached parenthood, friendship, and simple human connection with the same intensity she had once reserved for hostile takeovers and quarterly earnings reports. But instead of calculating angles and strategic advantages, she was learning to navigate by entirely different stars. Sophie's laughter, the satisfaction of a shared meal, the quiet contentment of reading together on Sunday afternoons. Sophie, with the wisdom that children sometimes possess in abundance, had quickly adopted Catherine as an honorary family member, referring to her as Mark's friend who's learning to be regular people, with the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that made adults marvel at childhood's capacity for inclusivity. Catherine treasured these interactions with an intensity that sometimes surprised Mark, storing up every silly joke and spontaneous hug as if they were precious gems. She began to understand that real wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios or corporate acquisitions, but in the currency of trust and affection freely given and received. The first time Catherine said "I love you" to Sophie, it happened so naturally that Mark almost missed its significance. They were baking cookies together, flour dusting the kitchen counter, and Catherine's usually immaculate appearance, when Sophie reached up to hug her and Catherine responded automatically, "I love you too, sweetheart." The words seemed to surprise her as much as they touched Mark, as if she had discovered a capacity for unconditional affection that she hadn't known still existed within her. The shift in their relationship from friendship to something deeper happened gradually, like seasons changing, so subtle that neither of them could pinpoint exactly when caring friendship had transformed into something more profound. Mark had been alone for so long that he had almost convinced himself he was content with the life he and Sophie had built together. But Catherine's presence had become as natural as breathing, as essential as the morning coffee that started each day. She fit into their routines, not like an intruder, but like a missing piece they hadn't known they were lacking. Catherine, for her part, found herself thinking less about quarterly projections and more about the simple pleasure of coming home to voices, calling her name, of being needed not for her business acumen, but for her ability to help with algebra homework, or mediate disputes over television remote control privileges. The penthouse that had once felt like a showcase now seemed impossibly sterile compared to Mark's cluttered apartment, where every surface told a story of lives fully lived and love freely shared. The evening, when everything finally crystallized, began like any other, with Catherine arriving straight from work, still wearing her corporate armor, but immediately shedding it in favor of the jeans and sweater she kept in Mark's closet for just such occasions. Sophie had finally mastered the piano piece she'd been struggling with for weeks, and her impromptu concert filled the apartment with music that seemed to embody all the joy and hope that had taken root in their unconventional family. Mark watched Catherine watching Sophie, seeing the pure wonder in her eyes as she witnessed childhood triumph firsthand, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. Later, after Sophie had been tucked into bed with stories and songs and promises of pancakes for breakfast, Mark and Catherine found themselves alone in the comfortable dimness of his living room. The silence between them wasn't empty, but full, pregnant with all the words they hadn't yet spoken and all the possibilities they hadn't yet explored. Catherine sat curled against one end of the sofa, her legs tucked beneath her, looking more relaxed and genuinely happy than Mark had ever seen her. "I need to tell you something," Catherine said suddenly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that immediately captured Mark's full attention. "I know this probably sounds crazy, and I know it changes everything between us, but I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship." She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she continued. "I love you, Mark. Not just as a friend, not just as someone who saved me from my own worst impulses, but as the man who taught me that strength doesn't have to mean isolation, that success doesn't have to cost your soul. I love the way you see the world, the way you've raised Sophie to be kind and curious and brave. I love the life you've built from nothing but determination and love, and I want to be part of it, if you'll have me." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Mark felt his heart racing as he processed the magnitude of what she had just offered him. He had been alone for so long, had convinced himself that his capacity for romantic love had died with his marriage, that his heart had room only for Sophie and the quiet contentment of their life together. But looking at Catherine now, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression, Mark realized that he had been lying to himself about the nature of his feelings for months. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I love you too. I think I've been in love with you since that night in your penthouse, when you let me see past all the walls to the person you really are underneath. You've become essential to me, to us, in ways I didn't know were possible. Sophie adores you, and you've made our little family feel complete in ways I didn't even realize it was lacking." He reached for her hands, pulling her closer until there was no space between them, no barriers left to cross. "I want you to stay, Catherine. Not just for tonight, but for all the nights to come. I want to build something real with you, something lasting." The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative at first, as if they were both afraid of breaking the spell that had brought them to this moment. But gradually it deepened into something more confident, more certain, a physical manifestation of all the emotional connection they had been building for months. When they finally broke apart, Catherine was crying again. But these were tears of joy rather than sorrow, the overflow of a heart that had learned to feel deeply again after years of numbness. "I never thought I would get to have this," she whispered against his shoulder. "A real family, people who love me not for what I can do for them, but just for who I am. I spent so many years convinced that love was a luxury I couldn't afford, that emotional connection was a weakness that would destroy everything I had worked for. But you and Sophie have shown me that the opposite is true, that love is what makes everything else worthwhile, what gives meaning to all the success and achievement I thought mattered so much." Their wedding, when it finally took place 18 months after that first vulnerable night in Catherine's penthouse, was a small affair that perfectly reflected their shared values. Instead of the elaborate corporate event that Catherine's status might have demanded, they chose a simple ceremony in the park where they had taken Sophie for countless weekend adventures. The guest list included Sophie's classmates and teachers, Mark's co-workers, and a carefully selected group of Catherine's employees who had become genuine friends rather than professional contacts. Sophie served as the maid of honor, her face glowing with pride as she watched the two people she loved most in the world promise to love and support each other for the rest of their lives. 5 years after that first vulnerable night in Catherine's penthouse, the Sterling Townsend family had become something remarkable, a testament to the transformative power of love offered without conditions or expectations. Sophie, now 13 and showing signs of inheriting both her parents' intelligence and her adoptive mother's determination, served as the living bridge between Catherine's corporate world and Mark's more grounded perspective. She moved easily between both environments, equally comfortable at company picnics and board meeting presentations, embodying the best of both worlds in her confident, compassionate approach to life. Catherine had not only maintained her position as one of the most successful CEOs in the industry, but had revolutionized the way success itself was measured and achieved. Under her leadership, Sterling Dynamics had become known not just for its financial performance, but for its innovative approach to employee welfare and corporate responsibility. Other companies studied her methods, trying to understand how she had managed to increase both profitability and employee satisfaction simultaneously. The secret, Catherine often told business journalists who interviewed her, was simple. When you treat people as whole human beings rather than just resources, they respond with creativity, loyalty, and productivity that no amount of fear-based motivation can achieve. Their love story had become something of a legend within their professional and social circles, proof that even the most unlikely transformations were possible when people were willing to be vulnerable with each other and to prioritize human connection over personal advantage. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat together on the same sofa where Catherine had once broken down and Mark had offered her a simple glass of water, they reflected on the journey that had brought them from that moment of crisis to this celebration of love and family. The apartment around them bore the comfortable marks of a life fully lived. Family photos covering every surface, Sophie's latest art project taped to the refrigerator, Catherine's reading glasses forgotten on the coffee table next to Mark's crossword puzzle book. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just walked past me that night?" Catherine asked, curled against Mark's side with the contentment of someone who had finally found her place in the world. "If you had minded your own business and left me to figure things out alone?" Mark considered the question seriously, thinking about all the small choices and moments of courage that had led them to this point. "I think you would have found your way eventually," he said finally. "You're stronger than you gave yourself credit for back then. But I'm grateful every day that I didn't have to find out what our lives would have looked like without each other." Catherine smiled, remembering the broken woman who had stumbled through that office building lobby so many years ago, lost and isolated despite all her professional achievements. That woman had believed that vulnerability was weakness, that emotional connection was a luxury she couldn't afford, that love was something that happened to other people but not to someone like her. But Mark had shown her that the opposite was true. Vulnerability was the foundation of real strength, connection was what made success meaningful, and love was not just possible but essential for anyone who wanted to live a fully human life. "I love you, Mark Townsend," she said, using the words that had once felt foreign on her tongue but now came as naturally as breathing. "I love the man who saw past my armor to the person I could become, who taught me that the best things in life can't be bought or negotiated or strategically acquired. I love our life together, our beautiful daughter, the family we've built from nothing but hope and determination and the courage to be vulnerable with each other." Mark's response was wordless but complete, a kiss that contained all the promise of the years still to come, all the love they had discovered in the ruins of their separate loneliness, all the gratitude for the simple miracle of finding each other in a world that often seemed designed to keep people apart. Outside their windows, the city hummed with the energy of millions of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles, but inside their home, 3 people who had chosen to love each other unconditionally were creating something that transcended individual ambition or achievement. They were proof that transformation was possible at any age, that it was never too late to tear down the wall.